We're joined now by Tim Verghese from inside Nebraska. Tim, what's going on, man?
Hey, not too much. How about y'all? Enjoy the bye week.
Oh, kinda. Are you gonna get out and you gonna be like some guys on Nebraska's coaching staff, the head man in particular, and get out and see a high school game, or what's on tap for tonight? I know tomorrow is loaded with college football. What's on tap for tonight?
Yeah, I'm going to see Connor Booth. I want to make sure get out to see him. Just to get eyes on him. I want to be able to put it into
Considering he's
context.
putting up circus like numbers.
Yep. And that's the thing. I want to be able to put that into context. I mean, we talked about it last week. Like, again, D1 players don't get tackled very often. Good D1 players don't get tackled very often at the high school level. But I think it's important to put into context the level of competition he's playing at and trying to get an idea of how that'll translate to the next level.
Tim, when you're going to some of these smaller schools to make those evaluations, like obviously the level of competition is not going to be the same as, say, the Blue Valley game last night, right, where Coach Rule was at checking out Dawson Merritt. But so, like, how do you put that into context, knowing like, hey, this is probably the only D1 athlete in any sport on this field in most instances? Like, how do you kind of get a frame of reference for that with a guy like Connor Booth?
Yeah, I think it's important you go out there and you're just looking to see how much better does he look than everyone else around him. You're expecting if he's the lone D1 commit or D1 type player on the entire field, you're expecting him to look different. How much different does that look? Because I've seen I wrote it up this week just because someone had asked me about that as well in our mailbag this week about just why does level of competition matter in evaluations, and I basically just said it's like, again, if you are a D1 player playing against lower level of competition, you should look the part. Like the two of the best players I've ever seen against lower levels of competition are Dalton Brooks and Terry Bussey, who both start at Texas A&M right now as freshmen. And those guys were doing everything for their team. They're playing running back, they're playing DB, they're playing linebacker, they're returning kicks, returning punts. They're scoring and contributing in every possible way. Like both of them leading their teams basically all on their own to state championship type success.
Tim, let me go back to Merritt real quick. I got a lot of guys, at least a handful down in that area. Do you think Dawson Merritt is the best defensive player on that team?
Ooh, I think so. I think so.
That feels like a loaded question.
I just was getting.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'd say so, just because, on top of just the physical tools, I would say the instincts are something that are high level for a kid his age, just because of who his family, and the amount of film he watches, and kind of just the way he was raised around the game. Just in the same way, we talk about Dylan and how being raised by an NFL center helps you learn a lot more about line checks and adjusting things at the line. Like being raised by an NFL head coach, like it just teaches you to watch film differently. And as a linebacker, you're seeing that start to translate in Dawson's game over the last 2 seasons.
So let's talk about Dawson for a second here. Obviously, he's still committed to Alabama, but Coach Rule's down there last night. He was back in Lincoln a few weeks ago. Where is Nebraska at with Dawson Merritt?
The feeling just coming out of last night, and Greg Smith was on the scene yesterday, so talking to him last night and talking to some people around there, the feeling around there right now is it's coming down to Nebraska and Alabama. Like it's truly like not obviously he's committed right now, but it feels like a recruitment again, and it feels like it's just coming down to those two schools, those two really battling it out down the stretch here, and it feels like it's one of those things that it may not happen imminently, but it may be something come signing day where we're like, hey, just don't forget about Dawson Merritt. Like what, Nebraska's got most of the class in the boat. What are they really waiting on? And it's going to be like, oh, can they flip Dawson Merritt on signing day? Like it feels like it's one of those type of recruitments right now where Nebraska's going to have to keep chipping away. But I mean, things like Bama's loss to Vanderbilt, Nebraska's defense playing the way they have. I think an important thing down the stretch here too would be getting some idea of what Tony White's future looks like too. Is he going to stick around in Nebraska?
Yeah, that's the thing.
Yep.
That's the thing. Although, no, I'm not going to get into the wagering on how long I think T. White's going to be around. TV, let me ask you something. And this is a little off the radar, but could you foresee a deal? Depending on what's happened, because the wins and losses thing got me focused on Missouri, right? And what happened with them. And obviously Williams and Lacey, two guys Nebraska was in on. down the stretch, pretty much. Aren't really playing for drink right now, and who knows, right? He could be one of those guys that could be on the move. Could you see any guys, and you don't have to be specific, but Coach Rule and this staff being a staff where guys circle back based on what they learned in recruitment versus what they thought Nebraska had to prove and show before they said yes, as they watched Nebraska's ascent?
I think so.
Those are just two guys that come to mind because
and I think
early.
Yeah, those are two good names too. I think to circle just because, and I think the Missouri conversation is something that we don't need to necessarily get into right now because we're speculating what they might do down the stretch of the season. But I think it factors into the Jackson Cantwell conversation as well because he currently sees Missouri as a contender and Nebraska as a team that's getting there. But I think both programs are more similar than everyone thinks. I think they're in different spots as where they're going, but I think they're closer in trajectory than people think. And in that same boat, like that does apply to Williams and that does apply to Lacey. But yeah, like in general with that class, Nebraska just didn't have time to capitalize in the 2024 cycle on landing Dylan Raiola. And I think a lot of those guys are now watching Dylan, a guy they got to know pretty well through the recruiting process, because Dylan was a guy that went and built relationships and did peer recruit at previous spots. He just never had that time in Nebraska. I think that's going to be a thing where, a couple guys are checking in on Nebraska if they're in the portal. Even if they're not in the portal, they're going to be like, hey, would I have a spot there? That there's going to be some feelers out. And it's not to say, anything necessarily illegal is happening. It's just kind of the way the game is right now.
We're talking with Tim Verghese from Inside Nebraska. Tim, speaking of guys that are committed to places that maybe aren't having the years they thought they would, Chase Lofton here locally is committed to Florida State. We've already seen a bunch of people from that 2025 class for Florida State kind of jump ship. Have you gotten any sense of what you think might happen with Chase Lofton as this recruitment continues to play out?
I think suitors are circling back there too, especially with the kind of the senior year he's having. Again, I said it back, and I still believe it. I think if you're gonna put odds on who can flip him away, I still give A&M the edge over Nebraska. And I could again see some other contenders also entering that. Like, I just think right now it's going to take him showing real interest in Nebraska for me to see Nebraska as like a real player again there. Because just since he's committed, I don't think we've seen that genuine, real interest in staying home. I just haven't gotten that.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, and I don't know enough. I'm just the context clues. I don't know if he wants to be. He doesn't strike me as somebody that I think he wants to get away, which is okay. Like there's been, it's a lot of kids. It's just like I remember Xavier Watts was like, I just want to go someplace different.
It's better for some kids. Yeah. I mean, it just is.
Right. And that's just my feel on it as well. Like, I just think, like, again, the allure of playing in the SEC, trying something new, like being raised in the Midwest and wanting to experience something new. Like, I understand all of that. And I think that's just kind of where he's at right now.
Tim, let me ask you something. I've been asking some of our guys that follow this team pretty close, just on average, to ask, roughly, because this conversation centers around offense, roughly how many points Nebraska leaves on the field. Just in Nebraska City yesterday, I was talking to this crew, and they said anywhere from 14 to 17, which was the highest that I had heard.
Yeah.
But all week, the BCs, the Brunses, those guys, anywhere from 7 to 13 points on the field. If you're in that ballpark and you think the evolution of Nebraska's youth on offense in some spots, like Barney and, Dadell, who's only played 6 games, and obviously Dylan and Banks and Nair they're in their 6 games with this offense.
I mean, Gunnar Gatula.
Gatula's another one. Like there's a little bit of a laundry list there, right? If you believe in upward ascent in terms of their development, does that number get smaller for you as the season goes on, or does it is what it is because we perceive the schedule getting more difficult, kind of limiting the ability to not leave as many points out on the field?
I think it's kind of a mix, but I do think that number has to get smaller just because even with the defenses you're playing, like
What would you put it at? Are you in that neighborhood?
Yeah, I think I'm in that more closer to that 7-13 neighborhood. I think they are leaving a couple points on the field, but it's one of those things like again, like looking ahead at the schedule, Indiana, Ohio State, if this team is what they want to be and they're taking the steps forward, even against these better defenses, like that number should be shrinking still. Like you're going to have to be able to put up points on Indiana. You're going to have to be able to put up points on Ohio State. Like at some point or another, this offense does have to play 4 quarters of ball where they're finishing drives for 4 quarters.
Tim, how do you weigh the maturation of the young guys or the inexperienced guys on offense versus the upscale in competition over the next 6 games versus the first 6 games?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it all has to be relative, and I don't think people are gonna do again. Everyone loses context week to week, but I really think context is going to matter. Just comparing the first half of the season to the second half of the season, like Nebraska could pop up out of this bye week 0-2, and people would turn around and be like, "Oh, okay, they just came out flat out of the bye week." It's like, no, they played 2 of the best teams on their schedule, like out of the bye week, like. But I think if you're talking points and you're talking true metrics of what you're looking for, just on field, what you're looking for. I mean, the main thing I'm really looking for in these big games is how well these young guys specifically step up into that moment. We've seen Dylan step up into the moment and embrace it, but then we've also seen him get rattled. Kind of late against Illinois. We saw him get rattled against Rutgers. So how does he look against competition? Ja'Cory Barney loves to play football. I expect him to keep bouncing up from these big hits and all of that. But how does he kind of step up when, it's Caleb Downs across the field from him, like how does that look? Gunner, I think Gunner's a big one. I think how Gunner embraces this tougher stretch of the schedule ahead. Jack Sawyer, JT2 Maloa, Kamara over at Indiana. How is he going to embrace these tougher edge rushers that he's going to face? I'm really just looking more from a mentality and from a willingness to compete standpoint more than like an actual statistical standpoint through the backstretch with how tough the schedule is for the young guys.
All right. Before we get global with this weekend slate of college games in the Big Ten, I'm going to stay right there with Indiana because you mentioned something about their edge. And I'm watching these guys. I'm only on the third game against Power Four, so bear with me. So far, like generally speaking, pretty active front seven. A little undersized in the secondary. I'm still trying to figure out how fleet of foot this team is defensively, but they do a pretty good job of keeping things in front, right? They go from 2 to 1 and kind of rolling coverage. When you look at how this team is playing so far, how do you pit their personnel versus the statistics that you're seeing them generate on every week?
I think they're maximizing that. The biggest thing is they're maximizing practically everyone that's on the field. Like every guy.
That's an active front seven.
Yep. That's a big thing. And it's like I think they're just getting the most out of literally everybody. Like I think that's the biggest thing because it's a lot of guys that are overachieving. It's a lot of guys that are playing to probably the best football they've played in their careers. And it's a lot of some of the biggest contributors, D'Angelo Pons, Kamara, like I mentioned, all these guys kind of transferred in with there's some familiarity there. They transferred in with Cignetti. So that's part of it. And I think when you look at this team in general, my general feel is like, they're not doing anything super, super impressive schematically. It really is just like they just line up and they play football and they count that all 11 of their guys are going to execute better than all 11 of the team they're facing. And that just kind of feels like who they are. They're very disciplined. They play loose, disciplined but loose. They just execute like every single play. It's we're going to execute better than you. We're going to be marginally better than you, and it's led to their 6-0 start. And I do wonder what that looks like against a Nebraska team that I think they're going to face bigger challenges than they have all season.
Yeah, Tim, I'm curious about Indiana because I understand that there's a lot of really good players at non-power conference football in the country. I also understand typically if you're bringing in a bunch of guys from a James Madison or lower levels or something like that, at some point in the Big Ten, that's going to catch up with you just from a talent versus talent perspective. Have you gotten a good gauge for the overall talent level of Indiana, or are you still trying to figure that out based on who they've played?
I'm still trying to figure that out, and I really think that Nebraska game is important just for me to figure out what they're going to do this season, and also where they stack up too. Like I really do believe that because again, the one thing with Nebraska right now is the top guys on this team are experienced guys in the Big Ten, guys that have been around this conference for a long time and have seen a lot. So, if you're able to hold up against the Nashes and Ties and Tommy Hills and Deshaun Singletons and Marquise Bufords of the world, you can hold up in the Big Ten, it feels like, and on the flip side of that too, it's like, if you can hold up defensively against the size of Jamal Banks and Isaiah Nair and the speed of Ja'Cory Barney and that, I think the lines are kind of a wash in this game.
Yeah, I'm with you. This is the matchup. A little smaller DBs for Indiana.
Yep.
But you know what I think has to happen? I'll be curious on the road, Tim.
Yep.
If Dylan kind of cuts it loose, because I think if he does, and them playing so much zone behind that front seven, there's some plays to be made.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like you said, they keep everything in front of them, and that kind of benefits Dylan in Nebraska.
Yeah, kind of how they want to play. Yeah, how they want to play.
Yeah, exactly. And and it's like it's one of those things where it's like, okay, hey, maybe that open up the top isn't there for Dylan play to play, but he's never had an issue just taking off the little check down, and if guys have room to run, they'll maximize that room to run.
Yeah, I think when people let Dylan kind of pick apart little zone coverage in the intermediate range, that's I think where we've seen him be the best this year. Tim, as we kind of transition into the Big Ten schedule for this week, there's 4 games that I think are interesting in the Big Ten: Washington, Iowa, Wisconsin, Rutgers, Penn State, USC, and then obviously Oregon, Ohio State. Out of those 4 games, do you have one that you think you can learn the most about one of those teams?
I think Wisconsin Rutgers. I don't have a gauge on what Wisconsin is. I think Nebraska's the better program right now. I think Nebraska's the better team so far this year, but I think that Rutgers game is going to give me a good idea of who they are. The only other one I think is close is USC, just because this is a good opportunity for me to figure out kind of where they fit in the Big Ten and how they can stick, playing kind of these coast to coast type games.
So is it just because I'm so bad? I'm like, Tim, say Washington and Iowa. Is it because you think you know who Iowa is?
Yeah, I mean, I just again, if they come out this weekend and they're able to limit what Washington does offensively and also put up some points, I'll be like, oh, okay, well, there we go. But I think I know what that team is. They are who they are. They're going to play real good defense, and offensively they are going to struggle a little bit. And so it's like, if I need to see them be able to put up points, because we saw that early in the year, and it's like, oh, okay, maybe they've got something going. I want to see them be able to put up points on a Big Ten opponent, and Washington's a good opportunity to do that. I more than anything too, I'm also looking at what's closer on the schedule too. Like Iowa feels still so far out for me.
Tim, I kind of agree with you on those 2 games that you picked out because, and correct me if I'm wrong here, in your opinion, but like Oregon, Ohio State, unless there's a blowout one way or the other, I'm still going to think both those teams are good. I'm still going to think that both those teams have a shot to make the playoff, but I do feel like that Penn State USC game could dramatically change how I feel about USC one way or the other.
Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
It's definitely a time zone narrative game as I collectively roll my eyes.
People have never traveled before, DB.
Now, okay. But listen, I'm going to say this, Tim. I know this is your segment, so I'm going to let you go. I'm not going to do this, but I do feel like we're being a little disingenuous because all of us would take a direct flight if we could, even though we're flying. So let's not act like traveling 5 hours is not a big deal, right? Because if we could travel it in 2, we would.
Sure.
Now, how big of a deal it is, I don't know. But the narratives and jokes that are coming out of this time zone thing are kind of funny. I just don't think we'll be able to put pen to paper on a narrative, regardless of what James Franklin says, until the end of the season. Because right now, the better teams are winning. It doesn't matter what time zone they're in.
Right. I completely agree on that too. Like I think it's not like I think that statistics a little
Outside of Washington and Rutgers, like that was a toss-up, but the game was close.
Right. And that's like that's the thing. Like what does that record look like? 2-7 if Washington pulls, or 2-6 if Washington pulls that out?
Well, how do you feel about SC in Minnesota? Because that would be the other one.
That's the other one, and even that one, I just think like. Yeah, I mean that was a good learning lesson for what this USC team is, and also what this Minnesota team is.
I didn't like their matchup. When I said Minnesota would win, I told Ravi I just don't think SC is ready to be physical every week.
Yeah.
Yep.
I don't know if the time zone changes.
Well, that was my concern about SC coming into the year. Right? Was hey, they got their head beat in by Utah last year, and that's the most physical team on their schedule.
I just think the repetitive O-line, D-line play. It's just hard if you're not used to it.
To do it every week,
Yeah, they don't. I don't think they have the Big Ten trenches just yet, or the depth. Like I think the top end, especially in the O line, I think the top end is there, but the depth isn't necessarily there for SC. So yeah, I agree. Like I mean, those two games kind of toss ups. If the team that traveled comes out on the winning side of that, that statistic doesn't look as crazy as it does right now, and I mean, like again, like. Nebraska's traveling to USC. USC's probably going to be favored in that game, but then UCLA travels to Nebraska. Nebraska's going to be favored in that game. Like that's also part of it. Like the way these are happening are like you said, the favorite team is the one hosting for the most part.
So let me ask you something, and maybe you haven't gotten into it yet, but watch Indiana UCLA twice. UCLA keeps coming up in depth. Then I watch them. They were on in studio during a pregame show last week, so I didn't watch it all. But UCLA seems to be suffering from kind of a depth issue too. But have you watched any Indiana UCLA? Because I kind of felt like that score was misleading.
That's been a couple of these Indiana games. Like,
well, they score late a lot.
Yeah.
Yep. Even last week,
he's not afraid to stay on the gas.
Right. And last week, that was the thing. They pulled away a little late where it's like, hey, that game was 1-2 scores at one point, and they kind of pulled away. Last week, and even against Maryland, like that's kind of been.
Yeah, it was 21-21, middle of the third, right?
Right.
There's a couple turnovers in a row, and Sharpie looked at me and he goes, oh, Indiana's up 2 scores now over Maryland. And I'm like, how? Nebraska's only snapped the ball like 6 times.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a game where time of possession matters. Being able to hold onto the ball really matters. Just to keep the ball away from Curtis Rourke in that offense right now. I don't know. I need to get a better feel for Indiana. I just watch more and UCLA and put that game more into context too, because I do think UCLA's kind of been this like doormat of the conference so far this season. Like, there's been a couple, but they feel like the one that everyone's kind of like every week, like taking their turn to whoop up on. But I feel like the team's slowly but surely getting better, and there's legit talent there where it's like, hey,
depth isn't an issue for any of these teams. It's UCLA, not. Yep. I mean, like they got some good top end talent.
That's
for
Tim
sure.
From Inside Nebraska. Tim, we appreciate it as always every weekend.
But appreciate y'all.